All right, so this is a lesson on the introduction to anatomy and physiology. We're going to start with the definition of anatomy. The definition of anatomy is where you're studying of the structure. So in other terms, like where it is. So that's when we're learning where the bones are, knowing the names of your muscles, knowing the anatomical positions of the parts of the heart, the brain. That's your anatomy. Anatomy is the where. That's more memorization. We usually will learn that first in this class. A little bit more difficult will be the function. That is how, or the physiology. Physiology, function, they sound the same. That's how some students remember it. Physiology, function, they have the same F sound in the beginning. But your physiology, it's how the body parts work and carry out their life-sustaining activities. So in other words, it's going to be the physiology. So how does it work? So now that you know where the parts of the heart is, so that you know where the atrium is, what happens in the atrium, how does the blood flow, how does it get its electricity in order to pump it, that would be the physiology. So anatomy is the structure, where is everything in location to one another. Physiology is the function, how does it work. Just a little bit of background information on where these terms come from. Patella, femur, tibia, fibula, you can see the terms right on the page here, but this is all Greek and Latin. So early medical providers developed the language, and they were one of the first people to come up with these terms, so that's why they sound a little funky, is because they come from Greek and Latin terms. I do tell students, if you do see a class for Latin, it can be helpful if you want to be in the medical field, just because you would know a lot of terms going into school later. Okay, so here's our levels of organization. You're going to fill out your table that you see. So this may be a good place to you stop and fill out the table. Okay, so this is where you might want to pause and fill that out. So I'm going to move on now. So this is from least to most complex. So if we took a microscope and we zoomed in to the smallest structure, we would see chemicals. We would see atoms and molecules. Many atoms and molecules together make a cell, right? In other words, cells are made up of chemicals. An example would be your smooth muscle cells. We'll learn a lot about cells next standard. Tissues. So tissues are made up of cells. So many cells make up a tissue. A lot of different tissues make up an organ. A lot of organs make up your organ system, and all your organ systems make up your beautiful organism as we are. Okay, so you will see here you have the levels of organization from least to most complex. This means it's like pretty much the smallest to the largest, right? We know the organism is obviously larger than your chemical, and here's your examples. Okay, so you're going to fill this in the table if you haven't done so already. Here's a nice little picture you can kind of see. I thought she was really cute, that's why I added it. But you have your chemical level here, right? Your chemicals make up a DNA, the DNA here, right? So chemical would make up your cell. Okay, so you can see here, so all together makes your cell. All these cells make up a tissue. Your tissues, the tissues will make up your organ. Your organ will make up an organ system. This is your digestive system, right? This is your stomach, by the way. Stomach will make up your digestive system, and your digestive system is just one of many parts of the organism. Okay, so if you need it, you can see this picture here. So now you're going to do a little mini quiz and see if you can put them in order, and you will have that on your quiz. So that's this part here, but you're going to do that on the other side. Okay, so anatomical terminology is next. Okay, so this is how we describe where things are in relation to each other. It's really important for you to memorize these things now so that when you're learning more difficult terminology, so when we're in the integumentary system and I say something is superior to something else, you don't have to stop and think about what that is. So that's what this portion is. Okay, so again, you have another table. You may want to pause right now and do this portion, or wait till after. It's up to you how you want to do that. There will be a mini quiz after this, so just keep that in mind. So we have superior. Superior is towards the head. Okay, so superior, above. I think of that like superior, someone's better than someone else, they're above, right? So an example of that would be the forehead is superior to the nose. So what you're going to do is you're going to draw an illustration here, okay, and give me an example here. I know you guys don't know, some of you don't know a lot about the anatomy. That's okay, just use like forehead to nose. Okay, you don't have to use like specific digestive systems. Unless you know that, then do it. Inferior means away from the head or towards the lower body. Okay, so superior is above, inferior is below. And you'll see these are kind of paired together in opposites. Anterior is the front of, anterior or ventral. I can use any of those terms. Dorsal or posterior is towards the back. Okay, or behind. I like to think of A, anterior. A is the beginning of the alphabet, in front. Posterior, dorsal fin. A lot of students think that dorsal fin's on the back, and posterior post behind. Okay. The next two we're going to talk about is medial and lateral. Medial is towards the middle. So both start with the letter M. Medial towards the M line or towards the middle of the body. Okay, so towards the middle. Lateral is towards the sides. Okay, so away from the middle. So lateral, arms. Right? That's a good example. Or your kidneys, right? You have two kidneys, they're lateral. Medial, your belly button. Okay, something in the middle. Okay, so the next two are proximal and distal. Proximal will be close to the origin. So if you're saying something is proximal to something else, for instance, the lungs and the heart are very proximal. They're very close to one another, which you'll learn later because your lungs are oxygenating the blood that the heart pumps to the body, right? They need to be close. So proximal, distal is far away. So if you're talking about an organ and saying something that's far away from it, for instance, you can say, like from the head, one of the most distal things would be your foot, right? And that's just simple terms. And then we have superficial and deep. Superficial is towards the surface. Deep is internal. So superficial, I think someone's superficial, they think about the way they look, right? So it's outside of their body. Deep is going to be inside. So something that's very deep, that's when you're going to make the cut and look inside the body. Okay, so now pause and you're going to fill out the table, draw the structure, and then you're going to give an example. Okay, do the best that you can. And then there's going to be a mini quiz after this. Okay, so the next portion is anatomical planes and sections. So this is a sectioning of the body or an organ along different planes, often results in different views. So if you take a look here, I'm going to move this out of the way here so you can see the picture. Okay, so you have three different ones. So you have frontal or coronal. So this is the brain. I thought I would use one organ just so you can kind of see how it's different. So in this class, especially when we're labeling and which is the anatomy, of course, because we're figuring out what things are, we may need different sections. We need different views in order to see that structure. So we've got frontal coronal. Okay, your frontal coronal, which we'll talk about that in a minute. You have transverse and mid-sagittal. So you kind of see the difference of views here. So the frontal would be like cutting the brain this way. Okay, front, cut the front off, and coronal, they go together. I can use either term, so you want to memorize both. You have transverse, which would be like this way, all right? So that'd be separating the superior and inferior, and mid-sagittal, or sagittal. Mid-sagittal you'll see mostly, but this is the brain where you cut it right in half and you're seeing the side. That's separating left and right. Mid-sagittal is in the middle, and then you have just sagittal, which could be cut anywhere, right? It's just cutting it left and right. Usually you'll see a mid-sagittal plane though. So the first one we'll talk about is transverse. I try to give you guys 3 different pictures to help out. So it's a cut along a horizontal plane. Okay, so you're cutting this way. I have a really cool activity you'll do later on where you'll take Play-Doh and you'll cut it. But you cut it along the horizontal plane, dividing the body organ into superior and inferior parts. In other words, top and bottom. So you can see this picture here. Okay, he's being cut, sliced, separating the top and the bottom. This is what it would look like in the heart. So this is if we wanted to see our valves. If we want to see our tricuspid and bicuspid valves, you would cut the heart transverse. This would be the brain. Same thing. Okay, so if we wanted to see the gray matter versus the white matter, this is a great cut. You actually do this in your dissection later on. Okay, so that's transverse. Frontal or coronal, again, I always remember frontal, you're cutting the front off. Coronal, it just goes with the frontal plane. Okay, so this is a cut along the lengthwise plane that divides the body organ into anterior and posterior planes. So in other words, you're cutting this way. Right? We're cutting downwards, and you can see this picture right here, how you can see there's a plane being cut. So here's an example here where you're seeing the brain being cut frontal here. Okay, so this is like you already cut it mid-sagittal and you're cutting it again. So you cut it right here, and that's what you'll do in your lab later. And then this is the heart. The heart is always cut frontal. That's the only way you can see the atrium and ventricles correctly in all the valves. So that's the way that you'll cut that in the dissection later as well. And then the last one is your sagittal. Okay, so I put sagittal here, even though you'll see a lot of mid-sagittal planes here, but it's a cut longitudinal, dividing the body right and left. Okay, mid would be right down the middle, exactly equal left and right parts. So here you can see what it would look like in the entire body. You'll see this when we're talking about the female reproductive system. That way you can see the uterus, vagina, urinary system, everything all together. And then in the brain. Okay, in brain, in the dissection, that's the first one that you'll see. That way you can see the beautiful cerebellum, and then the brain as well, and with all the functioning parts. Okay, so now you'll do a little mini quiz about that. Okay, so the last part is the abdominal pelvic surface and cavity. This section is a lot of memorization. Okay, so there's two different parts that you'll see. So your abdominal pelvic region has a lot of organs, right? You have your digestive system, you have your urinary system, that's pretty much where all your systems are, is right there in this abdominal pelvic region. When we're talking about the region, we're actually talking about the bottom of your rib cage. So you can kind of see the bottom of your rib cage down. Okay, so you're really talking about that, your stomach, essentially. That's what it means by abdominal pelvic region. There's two different ways that you can separate it. It's the 4 quadrants that divides it into 4 equal quadrants. I'll show you a picture of that later. And there's one on your paper if you want to look at that. And there's 9 regions. The 9 regions is probably the more difficult of them to memorize. Your quiz, you will have a blank and you'll have to fill it in. So you want to practice, and we'll do that next. We'll do a lot of practicing after your note cards, of course. Okay, so we'll talk about the 4 regions first. I don't have a picture on here, but you have it on yours, and it's really easy. It's the left, you would have like the left upper quadrant, right upper quadrant, left lower, and left lower and right lower. And actually, before I get started, I need to talk about anatomical left and anatomical right. The best way to describe that is always the patient's left and the patient's right. Okay, so it's not going to be like right, left, it's going to be off, it's going to be switched. So like you're thinking about your patients. So what's my patient's right and what's my patient's left, which is going to be flipped, right? It's like a mirror. So anyway, so let's do the regions, the 9 regions. Those are more difficult anyways. And for the quadrants, look at your own paper. I didn't have a picture on here. So we're going to start superior and we'll work our way inferior. So you have the right hypochondriac. If you notice, it's the patient's right. So you're looking at your patients, it's their right. The reason why they call it hypochondriac, that gets some students confused, hypo, is because that's what this part of the rib cage is called. So the right hypochondriac, it's the region of the rib cage that is made out of cartilage. That's what chondriac means. So the right hypochondriac and the left hypochondriac. Okay, so again, right hypochondriac and left hypochondriac. Really, to study this, write it down, write it down. You have the epigastric, okay, so the epigastric, which is right above gastric region, okay. The umbilical region, students usually have a really easy part with that because the umbilical cord, right, that's where your belly button would be, right in the middle. Then you have your patient's left, right? So left lumbar, that's the part of your vertebrae that's called the lumbar, right? That's the lumbar region of your vertebrae. That's where it gets named. So left lumbar, right lumbar, okay? And then this I think is pretty simple as well, the hypogastric. So you have the hypogastric means below, hypogastric region. The left iliac, that's the name of the pelvic bone. It's the iliac, right? Regions right here. So left iliac. And then the right iliac. So you'll need to know where these are, and then you'll need to know what organs are in there. So for instance, knowing that most of the liver is in the right hypochondriac. And I give you guys a really good diagram on your paper that you can see. The left hypochondriac is where like your stomach would be, okay, and your spleen. Umbilical will be a lot of the lower regions actually has your intestines. That's what you'll see in a picture. But if you lifted that up, you would see where your urinary system was and your reproductive system. So that's something that you'll see as well. You'll practice that in days to come. Okay. So you'll do a little mini quiz, and that's it for now. And you'll move on to the next activity. How do I stop this here? Where is it? I don't know what's going on. Aww.